social. All right, there we go. Is Associate Professor of Social Foundations of Education at the University of Illinois. Her research examines the intersections of national security and public schooling in the United States. She is the author of 2 books, A Curriculum of Fear, Homeland Security in US Public Schools, and Suspect Communities, Anti-Muslim Racism, and the Domestic War on Terror. She has published numerous articles on topics like activist research, the racist underpinnings of policing, homeland security, and countering violent extremism, more specifically in public schools, and many, many more topics. She is a public intellectual and scholar activist who speaks to the media regularly, has spoken to stations like WBEZ and KPFA. She's spoken on shows like Voice of America, and she's been featured in newspapers like the Chicago Reporter. She is the co-author as well of several toolkits for community-based activists and advocates, such as Criminalizing Mental Health, a report on anti-terrorism initiatives in Illinois. And we're just so fortunate to have her with us at UIC. Ryan currently works as an instructor in the History and Critical Ethnic Studies departments at DePaul University. He received his PhD in East Asian Japanese history at the University of Chicago, and his MA is in Asian American Studies at UCLA. He is co-founder of Nikkei Chicago website, which highlights untold stories of the Japanese American community in Chicago. His academic publications include book chapters and articles on Okinawan regional autonomy and indigenousness, on Okinawan Peruvians in Los Angeles, on Japanese and Okinawans in Cuba, and on the pivotal Asian American movement activist Pat Sumi. His articles and op-eds have been featured in the Japan Times, the Ryukyu Shimpo, and the Rafu Shimpo. And we are just so honored and privileged to have Ryan Yokota with us. He has spoken many times in our GLAS community. He's been featured speaker in one of my classes recently, last year, the year before actually, and students just were profoundly impacted by both his research and his life history with these issues. So I don't know, how do we clap? I'll clap. Let's welcome everyone and our speakers, and we'll just open the floor to Nicole, who will begin.
Thanks so much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. There we go. Can everyone see the screen? I can't see you, but I'll assume that no noise means everything's working okay. Okay, thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Nadine, for that extraordinarily generous bio and introduction. And thanks to everyone working behind the scenes who helped make today possible. So today I'm going to be discussing my book, which explores the Federal Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE framework, that mobilizes community members and social service providers like teachers and mental health professionals to identify and report potential terrorists using various lists of warning signs of terrorist radicalization, some of which are listed here. These signs include things like outrage over US or Western foreign policy, travel to a Muslim country, and increased activity in a pro-Muslim social group or political cause. So the book really examines countering violent extremism programs in a really in-depth kind of way. So I'll focus today on some ideas that have stemmed from some work, stemmed from my work on the book, with an emphasis on how this research can inform abolitionist organizing. And I'm just going to jump right in. So I attended a 2016 peace-building conference where a retired FBI senior advisor explained that the United States relied on 3 primary tools to combat the perceived rise of homegrown terrorism: handcuffs, this is his words, handcuffs, body bags, and the closed case file. Given these resource-intensive killer capture methods that could miss arguably real threats like Pulse shooter Omar Mateen, the United States needed to create additional anti-terrorism tactics by mobilizing community members, social service providers, and religious leaders as proxy national security agents. A National Counterterrorism Center senior official similarly explained that, quote, families, peers, strangers, and trusted authorities like your wrestling coach, your Sunday school teacher, your imam, your school official could deter vulnerable individuals from terrorist violence by providing resources they need as a part of the healing process. So instead of immediately incarcerating terrorist threats, law enforcement agencies have collaborated with these trusted authorities who could use their daily interactions with their clients to identify potential violent actors and then provide interventions that help off-ramp individuals from the perceived pathway to violent extremism. So in this anti-terrorism approach, the provision of what security professionals refer to as pastoral care offers a fourth way to fight homegrown terrorism. And vying for new resources, police departments, social service providers, and community leaders have integrated this federal anti-terrorism model into local national security initiatives and caregiving practices. For example, the Denver Police Department argue that, quote, terrorist groups target isolated and alienated youth for recruitment, leading to a partnership with Goodwill Industries to counter this recruitment tactic by preventing the initial isolation. So leveraging this partnership, the police department conducted refugee and immigrant outreach, offered mentoring service to quote unquote disenfranchised youth not well integrated into their communities, and engaged quote faith communities, Black Lives Matter, diverse communities, refugee communities, and LGBTQ communities, among others, facing disenfranchisement by society and therefore potential terrorist threats. Concerned about the perceived rise of homegrown terrorism within its large Somali population, Minneapolis Public Schools announced plans to hire and train youth intervention workers who would spend time in the lunchroom and non-classroom setting, building relationships and trust through which they could, quote, spot identity issues and disaffection believed to be the root causes of radicalization among Somali youth. Advocating for the nationwide adoption of these countering violent extremism or CVE practices, security-minded psychiatry professors have explained that this community-led anti-terrorism approach is, quote, concerned with providing mental health services to those who need them but lack access, with the intention to reach individuals who are most at risk of becoming radicalized to violence but need not have committed crimes or violence. So specifically targeting so-called vulnerable populations for terrorism-focused mental health treatment. So after decades of revanchist policies that have downsized social welfare while upsizing coercive policing, the US security state has reinvested in disinvested communities by transforming the public provision of social supports into a global war on terror weapon. And as the war ravages onward, the security state has exploited the neoliberal erosion of healthcare, of education, and other social services to develop new anti-terrorism methods that mobilize helping professionals and caring institutions. For example, one Somali leader reasoned that, quote, in an ideal world, you'd want to have all the funding you can get for domestic programs, for social services, for these women's empowerment programs, for soccer programs, but it doesn't exist right now. Given these economic conditions, this leader accepted money from the Department of Homeland Security's 2016 Countering Violent Extremism grant program to fund after-school programs, even as community members warned that this amounted to community-led surveillance. He rejected these concerns, saying it's bullshit. The parents are struggling with their kids' education because they're not educated and the kids need tutoring. If someone else is willing to pay for it, let's go for the money. Although community members worried that collaborating with the Department of Homeland Security would intensify anti-Muslim racism, this community leader was willing to, quote, compromise to gain access to new resources that could support positive youth developments. So rather than address the conditions that create the need for social supports, like surviving military interventions, experiencing racial violence, and enduring the withering of social services, the US security state deploys care as a global war on terror strategy. So given this securitization of social services, targeted communities have rejected the premise that they only merited access to these resources as ticking time bombs, rather than as deserving members of society. And given their use of life-affirming institutions to expand carceral power, I argue that countering violent extremism programs constitute one form of carceral care work that intensifies anti-Muslim racism. understanding how the state historically has responded to the criminal legal system's crisis of legitimacy by developing ostensibly friendlier policing programs, the term carceral care work captures the mobilization of care work to fortify carceral power, the making of this care contingent on participation in or subjection to community policing, and lastly, the activation of liberal narratives that frame these practices as a way to reduce the reliance on law enforcement and increase access to services. So in the context of the domestic war on terror, the US security state has instituted carceral care work by mobilizing social service providers like your therapist as terrorist watchdogs, intensifying Muslim youth's contact with police officers through the provision of social supports, and then justifying these tactics as a progressive alternative to previous punitive practices. So in this way, the US security state administers care to legitimize anti-terrorism initiatives and to extend policing deeper into the intimate spaces of everyday life, from gym locker rooms to therapist offices. So given these practices, for me, the term carceral care work captures how the US security state has intensified the relationship between care and control to advance its global war on terror agenda. I also view the term carceral care work politically useful in militating against liberal discourses that justify and encourage social service providers to participate in these illiberal methods. And these tactics draw from and articulate with past counterinsurgency tactics. In Vietnam, for example, the United States established its CORDS, the Civil Operations Revolutionary Development Support Program, in coordination with USAID, the CIA, and the State Department, to fulfill President Johnson's so-called pacification program by arguably protecting rural communities from insurgent forces, weakening insurgent infrastructures, and winning over people's sympathy for the South Vietnamese government and US forces. The US deployed the CORDS initiative across South Vietnam, with each provincial program led by a local community leader. In other words, the provision of humanitarian aid in collaboration with community leaders amplified US military operations in Vietnam. And my own interest in CVE actually stems from hearing my own family stories of USAID, which they nicknamed the CIA, in Vietnam as a way to increase surveillance of Vietnamese communities during the war. In Palestine, the US similarly uses humanitarian aid to intensify its occupation. Political geographer Lisa Bengalia has examined the strategic delivery of humanitarian aid to the West Bank and Gaza by USAID in ways that both mitigate the most deleterious effects of military occupation while extending a regime of war and policing into ever more intimate spaces of Palestinian everyday life. The USAID mission in the West Bank and Gaza is shaped by a presidential executive order from the US that prohibits transactions with individuals who commit, threaten to commit, or support terrorism, which includes essentially any support for members of groups such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and Hamas, which of course governs Gaza. So to ensure compliance with this executive order, USAID requires grant awardees to sign a form that actually confirms that they don't have connections to or endorse so-called terrorist activity, which includes any kind of support for Hamas. So Bengalia reports that fear of unintended violation and prosecution under US terrorism legislation has meant that many organizations receiving any kind of support or US funding have built anti-terror infrastructures into their programs, with ever-expanding circuits of securitization intimately shaping these foreign aid interventions in Palestine. And of course, as in Vietnam, augmenting its military operations. So the cases of Vietnam and Palestine demonstrate how the provision of humanitarian aid has expanded US empire and supported regimes of war and policing. And we'll return to this idea later, particularly since CVE uses the provision of social services and aid to intensify the domestic war on terror in ways that articulate with more coercive counterterrorism tactics, both military operations abroad and widespread surveillance within the United States. For example, the NYPD recruited mosque crawlers who acted as inside observers in mosques, reporting on sermons and employing what they call a create and capture method to create conversations about terrorism and then capture and report people's responses to law enforcement. The NYPD also tasked undercover police officers with raking the coals to find terrorist hotspots by monitoring conversations at sites frequented by Muslims, including restaurants and sports venues, which they created dossiers on all of these venues. One example is here on the screen. Oftentimes, the FBI entrapped Muslims to force them to serve as informants in these covert operations under the threat of prosecution, incarceration, and/or deportation. So through these criminalizing technologies of control, the US security state has treated Muslims as the enemy within, incipient homegrown terrorists. And as Deepa Kumar observes, while the foreign policy establishment oversees the war on terror enemy abroad, the law enforcement apparatus targets the enemy at home. The net result is a spectacle of terrorism that is constantly kept alive in the American imagination. So domestic counterterrorism practices have contributed to broader global war on terror operations. And these practices, of course, draw from and contribute to longstanding counterterrorism tactics, including those used to facilitate the incarceration of Japanese people in the United States. Although many studies have focused on the brutal psychological and material violence of incarceration itself, it's important to note that much like the Nazis' widespread surveillance and record keeping prior to its formal institutionalization of death camps, the US slowly narrated the threat of a so-called yellow menace and Japanese problem, racist discourses that justified preparations for and execution of mass arrests of Japanese leaders and political dissidents before the Pearl Harbor attacks, tactics that would eventually facilitate rapid arrest and incarceration in 1941. Including, for example, the 1937 Coast Guard order to compile extensive files on Japanese fishing boats off the coast of Southern California, in addition to other federal watch lists identifying both individuals and businesses perceived to threaten national security, again, showing the relationship between US empire's global military operations and domestic policing practices. And the FBI flagged individuals seen as quote unquote potentially subversive for doing things like subscribing to nationalist magazines, heading a dojo, teaching the Japanese language, and making any kind of statement that expressed favor to Japan. And these practices continue to haunt national security paradigms, most evident in the development of lists of warning signs of future terrorists that echo some of these other indicators of potentially subversive activity. So to return to the case of CVE, given the growing resistance to the police infiltration of mosques, the blanket surveillance of Muslim communities, and the use of sting operations to ensnare otherwise law-abiding Muslims, policymakers argue that emerging anti-terrorism initiatives could increase community control over the domestic war on terror, could amplify Muslim voices in the political process, and could improve community police relations, all while facilitating access to community resources and social services. So in this approach, CVE represents a liberal commitment to protect the civil liberties of targeted communities while engaging in operationally relevant practices, such as developing trusting relationships between police and communities that can serve as a platform for addressing many public safety threats, including but not limited to violent extremism. So policymakers and practitioners viewed CVE as a way to diffuse community resistance while creating new policing tools to identify, report, and deter potential terrorist threats. And this has a hallmark of community policing programs initiated, for example, after uprisings during the Black freedom struggle and other uprisings in the current context. Community policing is being pushed by the Biden future administration. So exploiting the continued neoliberal erosion of social welfare, CVE practitioners have integrated the provision of social services into their anti-terrorism initiatives. One practitioner, for example, admitted to accepting state funding allocated for countering violent extremism, reporting that, quote, that money paid for after-school programs, it paid for coaches, it paid for job retraining, it paid for parents being aware of their kids in schools, and it paid for a lot of good things within my community. A civil rights advocate in the same community, however, argued that although this money is needed regardless if terrorism is that connecting dot, saying that this money would solve this problem makes it toxic. In his view, a white parent who's poor in South Carolina would not send their child to T-ball that's called the anti-Dillon Roof T-ball, because the assumption is that that's bad for kids. Instead, Muslim parents simply want to take their kids swimming, and that has nothing to do with CVE. In other words, earmarking certain social services as an anti-terrorism initiative risked alienating communities because it would be seen as for the bad kids, and reinforced the notion that Muslim children only deserved access to these resources as ticking time bombs. So some Muslim parents question the integration of social services into the domestic war on terror, while others agree to participate in order to gain access to resources otherwise unavailable to them, even if it meant that, quote, some elements of surveillance accompanied these resources. So despite community concerns about the intensifying relationship between care and control through the institutionalization of the federal CVE framework, law enforcement agencies, community organizations, and caring institutions alike eagerly sought funds and partnerships to establish local programs. The Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, which is located here in Chicago, applied for and received federal funds to train mental health professionals on how to off-ramp individuals who exhibit the warning signs of radicalization to violence, arguing that individuals closest to those at risk are best positioned to intervene, recognize problematic behaviors and warning signs, and make referrals. The city of Houston similarly pursued federal funding to develop parent and youth workshop curricula and support tools focusing not only on terrorism ideologies, but also on the root causes of extremism, providing information about risk factors, community connections, and social supports. To implement its initiatives, the City of Houston planned to partner with law enforcement agencies, academic institutions, and nonprofits like the Islamic Center for Greater Houston to provide social support resources for families with youth who may need support resources, but not law enforcement intervention, that could minimize the isolation and disenfranchisement of Muslim youth perceived to fuel the terrorist radicalization process. Although partnerships with the FBI, regional intelligence service centers, and local police departments typically have supported CVE programs like the City of Houston's, practitioners promoted their work as quote unquote community-led violence prevention efforts that bring together all stakeholders that need to keep our community healthy and safe, such as our faith communities, our schools, service providers, mental health and behavioral health services, and our local law enforcement agencies. Another practitioner concluded that, quote, although the community and hopefully community-led programs should be the bulk of what we're doing to build resilience against violent extremism, we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking it could be done without the support of law enforcement. My program would have never been possible without the local police department. So by defining their community-led initiatives as an alternative to what they refer to as the disturbing work of law enforcement-led anti-terrorism programming, practitioners defended their ongoing collaborations with law enforcement agencies. Yet this portrayal of CVE actually obscures how practitioners have called on mental health professionals to take on the functions of law enforcement, identifying and reporting perceived threats, and transform their clinical practices into sites of surveillance. So as community organizers have argued, quote, surveillance is surveillance no matter who is doing it. Such a critique captures how caregiving practices and life-affirming institutions can discipline, punish, and control targeted populations in ways similar to law enforcement agencies, ultimately expanding carceral power in the process. Given the interplay between care and control, countering violent extremism programs draw from the US security states' counterinsurgency practices used in places like Palestine and Vietnam, through which humanitarian infrastructures, technologies, and practices constitute key sites through which the relation of war is sustained and reproduced. As a so-called fourth way to fight the perceived rise of homegrown terrorism, the Countering Violent Extremism framework strengthens policing by expanding the reach of law enforcement agencies into caregiving spaces, such as therapists' offices, and by facilitating information sharing through the provision of social services. So by extending the security agenda into realms of care, social work, and education, CVE expands carceral power and intensifies the domestic war on terror, particularly in Muslim communities, while appearing to offer a liberal alternative to conventional counterterrorism practices. And to integrate care work into the domestic war on terror, policymakers and practitioners turned to a body of social science research identifying how an ordinary person transformed into a so-called terrorist. And many of you know here at UIC that there's West Campus faculty who have been central figures in the production of this research for the last 10 years. But most of this began in the 1990s when social scientists began developing theories of radicalization to understand the perceived process by which terrorists are made. So through this research, the hope was to get to what's referred to as left of boom, to predict and ideally to prevent future attacks or future bombings. And the term radicalization came to be the word that was used to refer to these human developments that allegedly precede terrorist attacks. So given the perceived rise of homegrown terrorism and the urgency to prevent future attacks, terrorism scholars sought to plot the perceived pathway to terrorism and the observable behaviors that signal progression in this process. So in this view, this predictive knowledge could facilitate early interventions capable of preventing, slowing, or stopping the radicalization process, particularly by mobilizing what's referred to as a whole of community approach that brings together social service providers, religious leaders, police officers, families, and friends. So by concluding that addressing violent extremism requires significant new initiatives that extend beyond the criminal justice system and are a part of public health and policy, radicalization research has legitimized the use of social supports to fight the global war on terror by first identifying and reporting potential threats. So to establish these new practices, law enforcement agencies began publishing reports on the terrorist radicalization process. So in 2007, the NYPD published one of the most influential reports on the topic called Radicalization in the West, the Homegrown Threat. And this report has informed how police officers have identified and responded to perceived terrorist threats while on their beats. So the report outlined this predictable, so-called predictable and observable four-stage radicalization process defined primarily by a changing relationship with Islam. The NYPD argued that each stage of this process comes with distinct signatures and indicators, meaning that police officers could look for these warning signs to identify radicalizing individuals. And so the NYPD named gravitation towards Islam, growing a beard, becoming involved in social activism and community issues, affiliating with like-minded individuals as typical signatures that indicated progression in the radicalization process. And by indicting Islam as the main driver of the radicalization process, the NYPD's framework and predictive practices are imbued with and enact anti-Muslim racism. So informed by this report, the NYPD officers have used these observable behaviors in their daily patrols, including policing what they refer to as radicalization incubators, perceived to provide fodder or fuel for radicalizing, such as, and this is their list, cafes, cab driver hangouts, flop houses, prisons, student associations, NGOs, hookah bars, butcher shops, and bookstores, which are all code for sites frequented in New York City by Muslim, South Asian, Arab, Persian, and other immigrant communities. The NYPD even monitored Muslim college students at schools far beyond city limits, including the University of Pennsylvania, Yale University, and Syracuse University. One undercover agent even went on a whitewater rafting trip with students, recording student names and the number of times each student prayed. Such policing follows the NYPD report's conclusion that the final stage of the radicalization process is characterized by a unique set of indicators, including participation in what they refer to as outward bound-like activities like camping, whitewater rafting, paintball games, and target shooting. So if you go paintballing, you could be a future terrorist. So such predictive policing transforms innocuous student groups and activities like whitewater rafting into these reliable signs of terrorist radicalization and therefore important sites of surveillance. Over time, social scientists and law enforcement agencies reinterpreted these lists of warning signs, arguing that social service providers and community members could participate in the early identification of vulnerable individuals and then refer them to services designed to interrupt this radicalization process. So it's not just police officers engaging in this predictive work, it's also the police department partnering with health departments, school systems, and community organizations to help facilitate this early identification of future terrorist threats. The Nebraska Emergency Management Agency, for example, partnered with the University of Nebraska, the local fusion center, the local Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Education to, quote, increase awareness of observable behaviors associated with the radicalization process to mitigate the barriers to reporting and enhance the connection between state-level threat assessment resources and local trusted resources receiving reports. So essentially, the agency went out and taught communities how to identify potential threats using the CVE warning signs, and then taught them how to report these threats to law enforcement. So in this view, integrating the prevention of violent extremism into health activities specifically could enhance the identification and reporting of potential threats. So in Nebraska, the agency mobilized what they refer to as a public health prevention framework to prevent radicalization, even though it was this process that essentially was enhancing the reporting of vulnerable individuals to law enforcement agencies, again, intensifying this relationship between control and care. And these anti-terrorism approaches assume that community members and social service providers can apply their suspicions evenly by learning to identify potential threats of violence, take responsibility, and respond. This is an image of some nursery school kid who drew a picture of his dad cutting a cucumber, and they just thought he was drawing a picture of a cooker bomb. And so the kid got flagged as a potential terrorist. So in Maryland, for example, school staff who attended local radicalization trainings reported 25 students experiencing homesickness, acculturation-related stress, and economic stressors on the assumption that such feelings suggest they may be at risk of violent extremism. Staff referred these students, such as a severely homesick child from Afghanistan, to various services facilitated by community police partnerships. By treating common immigrant experiences like cultural and language barriers and homesickness as potential signs of radicalization, adults in these communities came to view Arab, Somali, Muslim, and other immigrant children as uniquely vulnerable to terrorist radicalization. So in describing the quote, perverse relation between the humanitarian and security articulations used to manage human trafficking, one security scholar argued that humanitarian and security discourses are happily married, marking trafficked women as both an embodiment of threat to Western states while simultaneously awakening sympathy as human beings threatened by some states. Countering violent extremism similarly engages the perverse relation between care and control, identifying Muslim children as both victims of predatory terrorist recruiters and as imminent national security threats. Despite the caregiving vocabularies used to define contemporary anti-terrorism initiatives, empirical research demonstrates how CVE has intensified, not mitigated, anti-Muslim policing, particularly as teachers have made thousands of referrals reporting the innocuous behaviors of Muslim children as suspicious activity. Such an analysis of carceral care work is critically important to abolitionist organizing. As policing practices morph, they increasingly call on caring, although always already punitive institutions like schools and social service providers to take on the work of law enforcement. As campaigns for police-free schools and counselors not cops gain momentum, it's important that abolitionist organizing doesn't ignore the ways life-affirming institutions can take on policing functions and ultimately enhance rather than mitigate carceral power. So re-theorizing caring spaces as carceral sites can help us militate against such efforts to co-opt social services in the name of national security. And many organizations today have begun campaigns like Services Not Surveillance, which refuse the integration of mental health professionals and other social service providers into the domestic war on terror and other policing regimes, while also demonstrating how abolitionist work must take seriously the demands to end US war and empire. And so today I've been collaborating with Vigilant Love, which some of you might be familiar with, an LA-based organization that emerged in the days following the San Bernardino shooting in 2015 as a rapid response to the anti-Muslim backlash across Southern California. And as some of you might be familiar with the organization, it began as a coalition that leveraged the longstanding relationship and solidarity between Muslim and Japanese leaders and programs since September 11th. So together through this work, we've worked on campaigns to end countering violent extremism programs, which includes agitating against the expansion of the carceral state in the name of anti-racism, treating white supremacists as domestic terrorists can only widen carcerality and policing of communities of color, and connecting this work to ongoing struggles for liberation and self-determination in Black, immigrant, Indigenous, and other communities of color in the United States, as well as Palestine, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. So ultimately, the social movement work recognizes how life-affirming institutions have contributed to the global war on terror by facilitating the criminalization of communities of color and the expansion of US empire, and therefore seeks to end the integration of policing and war regimes into the provision of social services, and to abolish essentially policing in all its permutations, including war-making enterprises. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Ryan.
I'll just intervene for one moment. So just so we can have like a brief pause. That was, wow, so incredible. And that was just so informative, really, and educational. I mean, you gave us a new concept, carceral care, to think about, that caring isn't always, a positive thing for our communities. It can also be a form of state violence. You've talked about, gave us a global approach to policing, connecting domestic to global, and you've shown us why we should take surveillance seriously when we think about abolition, and just so much more. And then the connections you made throughout, I think in the GLAS community, we're really grateful that you connected the, Japanese histories and Vietnam, and how those are in continuity with what we're seeing today with Muslims. So with that, let's turn it over to Ryan. The floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you for inviting me to this program, and thank you, Nicole, for this really wonderful presentation. So vitally important to what's going on here today. What I'll be talking about is in relation to the Japanese American experience prior to and during World War II, and how it relates to what we're talking about in terms of this countering violent extremism programming that's being promoted by the US government. And I think that the way that I want to begin to approach it is to really talk about the incarceration process and what preceded it, because really the comparison here between CVE, of course, is in relation to all of the types of surveillance and of the Japanese American community that had gone on prior to incarceration. Now, as we know, once Pearl Harbor is attacked on December 7th, 1941, this puts into motion a range of different incarceration procedures initiated by the US government, eventually leading up to the mass incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans in US concentration camps around the country. And I think the way that we can think about this process is really as a two-phase process. First, immediately after December 7th, 1941, there is already incarceration of Japanese immigrants, as well as Italian and other German immigrants in the months preceding the signing of Executive Order 9066, which occurs on February 19th of 1942. And that executive order then initiates the second phase of incarceration, which is the mass incarceration and the the evacuation of Japanese populations from the West Coast into largely 10 Japanese American concentration camps scattered around the country. And I think that when we think about the Japanese American incarceration, we have to think about, well, how is it that the government was able to identify so quickly after Pearl Harbor all of these Japanese immigrants to be incarcerated and arrested? People like my great-grandfather, for example, were arrested in the months after December 7th in 1941. And he was eventually sent to Department of Justice incarceration camps prior to being sent to the larger 10 War Relocation Authority camps that were set up after Executive Order 9066. And so the question is, how did the government get this kind of information, right? And to kind of go into that question, we have to, of course, think about where the Japanese American population was, even in the decades prior to 1941. They were, in many respects, living a very precarious existence. As we know, the 1922 Ozawa v. US Supreme Court decision had essentially blocked Japanese immigrants from being able to naturalize as US citizens. So, in that respect, they were sort of perpetually kept in this space as immigrants unable to naturalize. This, of course, is in contrast to places like Canada to the north, which did actually allow for the naturalization of Japanese immigrants as Canadian citizens. The other aspect, of course, was the 1924 Immigration Act, which essentially blocked Japanese immigrants from being able to come to the United States. This, of course, has been brought up as a close parallel to the Muslim ban that currently is in effect, that is blocking immigration from a range of different targeted countries that the Trump administration has identified. So these kinds of aspects, the sort of legislative and judicial decisions that limited Japanese immigrants and their rights in the decades prior to incarceration in 1941, I think are important for us to consider in terms of identifying the ways in which the population remained a very precarious one. Now, the aspects of surveillance that are really relevant to what Nicole is talking about began in relation to the Japanese American community even as early as the 1920s, but especially ramped up in the 1930s as the war began to become more evident and definitive. Even as early as the 1920s, the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence under the Navy Department and the US Army's Military Intelligence Division had already begun to engage in a range of activities to identify potential threats and to begin initial frameworks for plans that could involve the incarceration of people identified as potential enemy aliens, or as subversive threats within the United States. Some of this really escalates after 1931 when Japan invades Manchuria. But even at that point in time, it's still a little bit muted. And really we see this kind of surveillance of the Japanese communities especially ramp up by 1938 and especially 1939 when Germany, of course, invades Poland, and this really initiates World War II. What were these kinds of activities like? Well, much of it can be looked at in terms of basic FBI surveillance activities, where the FBI began to develop what are called custodian detention lists. These custodian detention lists were lists of German, Italian, and Japanese non-citizens who were suspected of being agents or sympathizers of their respective governments. And eventually, as these lists are developed, at the onset of the development of these lists, first they are targeting primarily German and Italian non-citizens who are suspect, but eventually they begin to identify more Japanese individuals as well as organizations that could be considered to be dangerous. And as a process of developing these custodian detention lists, they develop what are called ABC lists, which are basically different kinds of classifications, A lists and B lists and C lists, A lists being the people considered to be the most potentially subversive, B lists being those people or organizations which are slightly less subversive, and C lists which are still, individuals or organizations which are suspect. And eventually, especially by 1941 and by 1942, the Special Defense Unit of the Department of Justice, which kind of picks up from some of the earlier work done by the FBI, begins to develop these lists in a much more robust way. And particularly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, these lists are augmented in many respects to include larger numbers of Japanese individuals and organizations. Now, these lists themselves were certainly not without problems. Some of the organizations listed in these lists may have been sort of phantasmic in a certain sense. There's some question about whether or not some of the organizations listed actually existed in any real or formal fashion within the United States. And so it's a question about whether or not these were sort of like boogeymen added to the list as a way to sort of, show this real or imagined threat of Japanese subversive organizations within the United States. But really what the CVE work that Nicole is involved in is the reason why this is so important, of course, is the way in which it helps to identify either individuals or organizations and puts them within the sort of framework of potential incarceration or in the future. So really what I'm trying to emphasize here is just that these CVE activities are most dangerous, not only in and of themselves in terms of the way in which they sort of deputize and sort of appropriate activities within local communities, but I think that they're also really problematic because once you've developed not only the profiles, but also the list of individuals and organizations that could be targeted in a later sense, then that becomes very problematic. And as we see with the Japanese incarceration process, the results were horrific in terms of the wholesale abrogation of civil and human liberties for over 120,000 people in the United States. There are some similarities and also some differences in relation to the kinds of CVE activities that Nicole is pointing out, both in her talk and in her book, that I wanted to kind of point out. One of the things that I think is really interesting, and this is coming from Nicole's book, was the way in which the CVE models that she describes really end up targeting and seeing youth as a generational threat and put a lot of emphasis in developing activities that would try to address youth issues and work within a youth space, whether at the high school or college level or within the communities at large. And I think that for the Japanese American community, we also saw a certain kind of sense of how this generational framing kind of played out. One of the things that I want to talk about is what's called the Munson Report, which was a report developed in the months prior to Pearl Harbor in October and November of 1941. This Munson Report was developed by a man known as Curtis Munson. He was a special representative of the US State Department, and he was tasked with trying to conduct interviews and investigations within the Japanese communities in order to identify any potential threats and to kind of assess this question of loyalty, right? Like how loyal are the various components within the Japanese community at the time. And in this report, Munson kind of breaks down the Japanese community into different generations, right? The Issei or first generation, the Nisei or second generation, and then this group called the Kibei, which are basically Kibei, which are second generation Japanese with some kind of experience having visited or even having been raised for a substantial part of their life in Japan. The Munson Report is really important, and this Munson Report was highlighted by the incredible work of the scholar Michi Weglin in her book Years of Infamy as a report that was kind of buried in the process of incarceration. And what the report basically said is it looked at these different generations and it kind of tried to explain whether or not they represent any kind of threat or not. The Munson report, in terms of the first generation of Japanese immigrants, had very interesting things to say. And what they basically said is that the first generation of Japanese immigrants had spent largely a great amount of their life in the United States by the time of 1941. And they found that even though they are Japanese nationals, again, they're blocked from being able to naturalize as US citizens, that they largely see themselves as residents of the United States and will and have all of their affinities and all of their livelihood tied to the United States. And according to the Munson report, he said that the first generation Issei, largely, if given a chance, would like to naturalize as US citizens, right? So the Munson report, in terms of the first generation, kind of states that they're not very much of a threat. In terms of the second generation Nisei, the Munson report states that the Nisei are largely raised in the United States customs and cultures. They identify incredibly strongly with the United States. And the actual wording of the report is really fascinating. It says they are, quote unquote, pathetically eager to be American, right? So according to the Munson report, the second generation Nisei were also not a threat to the United States. And it's the third category of the Munson report that kind of is most interesting. And here he's talking about what are called the Kibei Nisei, the second generation Japanese Americans who had some kind of exposure to Japan, either traveling there or even being raised there for a significant amount of time in their life. And what he found, he split that category into two. He stated that those Kibei who had lived a large part of their formative years in Japan were probably the most suspect because they were raised in Japanese institutions, schooled in Japanese educational institutions, and were most sympathetic to the current sort of militaristic thinking of Japan at the time. But he also pointed out a second category of Kibei Nisei, who were those Japanese Americans who traveled to Japan at a later or older age, and after going to Japan found that they were vastly different in terms of character and personality from your average Japanese person at the time. And he found that those people ended up coming back to the United States being much more American and patriotic than even before, right? Because they were just so kind of turned off by what they had seen in Japan. So out of these three categories and out of the third category, these subset categories, in general, the Munson report finds that the majority of the Japanese American community is overwhelmingly loyal, and really the only people to really suspect would be these second generation Kibei who had gone to Japan and lived there for a very long time and had much of their formal education there in their formative years. Even though this report states that most Japanese Americans were overwhelmingly loyal, the report itself is largely buried. While it was shared with the State Department and the War Department and the Navy departments, it wasn't even shared with the president until February 5th of 1942, which was 2 months after Pearl Harbor, right? So it didn't even cross the president's desk until much later. And Michi Weglin points out the importance of this report to state that there was surveillance within the Japanese community prior to Pearl Harbor, and they had found overwhelmingly that Japanese people were loyal, but that this report was largely buried and could have been used as proof of Japanese loyalty and as a sort of more of a reason to not initiate mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. Now, one other thing that I want to point out is legislation such as the Smith Act, which was passed on June 28th of 1940. And this Smith Act, also known as the Alien Registration Act, largely was initiated to target subversives, whether or not from the left or the right, and was not necessarily situated within the sort of or the wartime activities per se, in a sort of larger sense, but it did required the registration of all aliens 14 years of age or older. And within this registration process, aliens would have to be registered as well as fingerprinted. And of course, that information was incredibly useful by the government in terms of identifying those enemy aliens that would need to be summarily arrested after Pearl Harbor. And of course, once Pearl Harbor occurs, the president initiates a proclamation called Proclamation 2525, which immediately allows for the arrest, detention, and incarceration of German, Italian, and Japanese non-citizens. Under the terms of that proclamation, some 17,447 Japanese non-citizens would be arrested either on the day of December 7th, 1941, or in the months after. And so this kind of leads into another aspect of what Nicole's book really talks about, which is the way in which CVE is trying to determine, differentiate between good and bad Muslims, right? So within this context of anti-Muslim racism, how do we determine which people in the community are good and which people are bad? Now, for the Japanese community, of course, after Pearl Harbor, and especially after the signing of Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, this, of course, brings about the wholesale evacuation and incarceration of, as I mentioned, 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And so within the West Coast, the question of how to surveil communities and determine good or bad Japanese is moot, right? Because everyone at that point in time is determined to be bad and is suspect and is therefore removed and incarcerated in the various Japanese American concentration camps. This is quite different, of course, from the experience in Hawaii, where they don't, initiate mass incarceration. They do, of course, have martial law. They do identify first-generation leaders in the community, much like in the mainland community, and incarcerate them in camps like Honouliuli in Hawaii, for example. But they are unable to initiate wide-scale incarceration because doing so would probably completely hamper the economic activities of the territory of Hawaii at the time, which was so dependent on Japanese American labor. So that Hawaiian case is a slightly different situation. Of course, martial law is imposed, and there are a range of different kinds of situations there. And as far as the rest of the mainland United States, outside of the Western states, which have been cleared of Japanese Americans, we don't hear as much of similar kinds of CVE type surveillance activities within local Japanese communities. I think part of the reason for that is we don't have enough research on that. I'm quite sure that there was a great deal of surveillance of different communities outside of the Western exclusion zone, but I haven't personally seen as much research on that and what that looks like outside of the Western states. So I think that's an area that future scholars should focus on to look at the sort of complexity of what the surveillance situation was like for the Japanese community. But then one other thing that I do want to point out is in relation again to this question of how to determine good versus bad, Japanese in this case, or in the case of CVE, good versus bad Muslims. In the Japanese American incarceration process, much of this attempt to try to determine good versus bad Japanese occurs sort of after the fact. So only after incarceration occurs and the West Coast is cleared of Japanese Americans, is there this more nuanced approach to trying to determine who's good and who's bad within the camp population. There's kind of a lot of debate as to why it is that they even decided to initiate this kind of a process. Most likely, as the war continued on, there were two competing concerns that kind of moved the needle around this question of trying to determine the loyalty of Japanese Americans who were already incarcerated. The first was just the continued cost of incarcerating 120,000 people in the United States. And, you know, as time goes on, that cost begins to be incredibly, you know, untenable, especially in the context of increasing war demands and, you know, the privations that mobilizing for a war effort of this scale required. But then the second aspect was that increasingly there was more of a demand for soldiers to serve in the military forces. And the Japanese American population and the population of young Japanese American males who could serve as soldiers in the US becomes increasingly attractive. At the outset of the war, especially by July of 1942, the young Japanese American men who originally had been eligible for military service under selective service end up being completely relisted as under a category known as 4C. 4C is a category stating that people are ineligible for military service if they are enemy aliens, right? And so regardless of the fact that these young Japanese Americans were indeed US citizens, on the basis of race, they are reclassified as 4C and therefore ineligible for military service. As the war demands continue, of course, there is more of a need for soldiers, and there's really a question of how do we determine which Japanese American youth can be recruited into the US military service, who can be drafted, right? And we don't want to draft bad Japanese, we want to draft the good Japanese, right? And so within the context of the incarceration process, the government in February of 1943 initiates what's known as the quote unquote application for leave clearance, also known as the loyalty questionnaire. And in this loyalty questionnaire, they ask two questions. One is question 27 and another is question 28. And these questions basically ask, number one, would you be willing to serve in the US armed forces? And number two, would you be willing to renounce any and all allegiance to either Japan or to the emperor? And so, you know, this questionnaire causes a huge controversy within the camps. And already there had been some extreme tensions that had been brewing within the camps in terms of, you know, whether or not people should, continue to work with the US government, whether people should take a much more strident position, whether they should, try to push for sort of a reclamation of their human and civil rights in a much more strident fashion.
Ryan, would it be okay, like 2 more minutes so we can make sure
yes.
that we can have a discussion? Thank you so much.
Sure. And so, you know, these kinds of questions are basically brewing within the community. And eventually these questions end up being used to determine who can actually leave the camps early. And also, of course, who ends up being recruited or drafted into the US military. And so the reason why I bring this up is to point out the ways in which there's always this process of trying to determine who is good and who is bad, who is loyal and who is disloyal. Within the Japanese American experience, there were these particular nuances and dynamics in play that basically determined what that looked like. Now, within the CVE process, the difference is that whereas before in the Japanese American incarceration process, the determination of loyalty was occurring within the process of incarceration, what Nicole is pointing out in terms of CVE is that this process of trying to determine who is good and bad, who is loyal or disloyal, is occurring at large within the community, right? And there are no restrictions on those activities. And of course, the threats that they, bring about are manifest in terms of, especially the way in which they're targeting youth, and of course, the way in which youth now are being put into the view of law enforcement and government authorities in ways which in some cases mirror the custodial detention lists that the Japanese Americans had to deal with prior to World War II. And so the threat is there, and that's why I think that this research that Nicole is engaged in is so vitally important.
Incredibly powerful, Ryan, just helping us understand these histories whereby communities are internally pitted against each other with this good cop, good Muslim, bad Muslim, good Japanese versus bad, and all the larger conditions and processes that, you know, underlie that, as well as allow it to continue today, either with, you know, the continuing legacy of trauma among Japanese Americans, or just revising these policies for other communities. But both of you together really help us think about solidarity, of course, and shared histories, joint struggles, coalition, and really not just, I think what hopefully this, one of the things this presentation did, in addition to just informing us of many things that are usually not talked about, but in addition to that, rethinking how we think of solidarity as not just two separate communities that have something in common where it's similar, and therefore we should be supporting each other, but instead of solidarity, to think of connected struggles that, you know, one struggle shapes another. And so we're already intertwined with each other, you know, because the system has intertwined the communities. And so it's a deeper, I think, sense of solidarity that, you know, might be thought about in terms of like joined struggles or coalition, just to get us out of that, you know, just the comparative or similarity type of approach. Because really, I mean, if we can't think about, if we can't take seriously how these histories that, you know, Ryan talked about and Nicole, you know, inform the current moment, then we're really missing an understanding of the root causes of why things are the way they are today, with whether it's the war on terror or and anti-Asian racism, anti-Arab and Muslim racism. So yeah, I'll stop talking. The floor is open to students or anyone, but I'd love to have students share questions first. So I don't think we're too big of a group. I mean, I think, you know, if someone just wants to say something, you can also put a question in the chat. Sorry, I didn't say that earlier, but so who wants to just chime right in? It can even just be a clarifying question, like, can you tell me more about this policy? Or I didn't understand what you meant by this term.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yasmin, and I'm currently taking Dr. Gonzalez's special topics between Asia Studies and Latin America. And I found this presentation super interesting and really insightful. So we're currently learning about, I guess, the similarities between incarceration in the United States, and then also how in Peru, many Japanese immigrants were taken to the US to be incarcerated as well, even though they were in Peru, and it's a different country and different relations with Japan. And then also similarly, how after 2001, there was an interest in Arab immigrants in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil because they were perceived as a threat. And so I just think this is as a threat for the US. And so I think this is just really interesting how, I guess, sorry, it's just amazing to me how there's monitoring outside of the US as well. And how these lists are made of good or bad Arabs, good or bad Japanese, even when they have nothing people with.
Yes, I mean, I think we kind of lost you, but I think we can just go and jump right in. Hopefully you can still hear the answer or the comment back. Nicole and then Ryan, maybe? How does that sound?
Yeah, I think CVE actually is the importation of the PREVENT program in the UK, and all across the EU, countries have developed similar CVE programs that essentially treat immigrant communities as these potential terrorist threats. So to know that essentially wherever the US is at war, they've also created these local surveillance programs that treat certain communities as the enemy within. And so that of course is true in all, I mean, the US is at war with so many places covertly or overtly. And so that's why I thought the Deepa Kumara quote was so important, was because it's about understanding the local in relation to the global and how the two are always connected. And so diaspora communities are always subjected to these policing tactics in the context of war, which is always ongoing. And so, yeah, you have people under surveillance all across the globe in ways that are similar to CVE, or in fact borrow directly from CVE, and are also quite different in other ways in other places as well.
Yes, this is a really great question. You know, the incarceration of Japanese Latin Americans in today's parlance, we would just call this rendition. And really, we didn't use those terms before, but now, of course, the idea of rendition is much more clearly and much more widely known now. In this sense, the Japanese incarceration process, I argue, is one that we need to look at as an Americas-wide process, and one in which actually drove the United States to increase their state presence, or to intrude upon the sovereignty of other countries, especially in Central and South America. And of course, the result of this was the rendition of both Japanese nationals and even nationals of other countries into the United States under this process. This is an often obscured or underappreciated aspect of the Japanese American incarceration process, which tends to focus much more largely on the US domestic citizen population as opposed to those Japanese Latin Americans who were brought to the United States. But basically, it is a very important cautionary tale as we talk about today's iterations of extraordinary rendition in relation to the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian populations that have been targeted after 9/11. And so I think that's a wonderful question, and it does ask a lot of questions, not only about state policies domestically, but also how those policies interject into other sovereign nations and their affairs.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Ryan, and thanks for the great question. Jasmine, what about others? Other questions? I have a question if no one else does. Does anyone have a question? Oh, here's one from Olivia. Has the general Asian American community discussed the Japanese American internment experience? Thank you so much for asking, Olivia. Ryan, do you want to go for that one?
I like to think that the general Asian American community's got a decent exposure to the history of the Japanese American incarceration process. Of course, it's certainly mediated by the fact that so many members of the contemporary Asian American community have, immigrated to the United States relatively recently in the last several decades, and so may not have been, as exposed to that kind of history. It certainly, points out the necessity for Asian American studies programs, for example, and the need to continue to teach this topic more broadly, because there are so many lessons to be learned here from that process. But thank you for your question.
Nicole, do you want to chime in on that?
I do think there's this, I feel like we talk about this with the Vietnam War of like when our generation's ready to talk about the experience, and when our generation's, ready to listen. And I think that's also true of having firsthand accounts as the generation that was incarcerated gets older. How do we capture those narratives? I always think the same thing of the Vietnam War of like people are very reluctant to talk about the war experience and to capture those firsthand oral histories, I think is really important. And so I think there is conversation about the experiences, but to what extent like that has been formally, there's great work on curating those stories, but it's not the same as some other communities who have had more resources and more time to really develop those resources and are at a place of where they can share those oral histories.
Thanks so much, Nicole. So important. I want to make sure we have time for others. Other questions? Feel free to put it in the chat. Or Anna, please.
Right. Thanks so much, Nicole and Ryan, for being here, but also making these important connections and interventions. And I really appreciate this, appreciate and also feel very terrified by this notion of by what you have illuminated in your book, Nicole, about the carceral care work, right? That this is in process. It is practiced in our institutions or, workplaces. And so I'm just wondering, I wanted to hear from both of you in terms of what do you think we can do? What would be sort of a call to action that we can take up as a way to counter CVE and kind of really rebuild our workplaces in ways that do not allow for this performance of care work that is really terrifying and just paralyzing. So yeah, thank you for raising awareness around these issues, but also really, looking forward to your insights in terms of what we can do.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a great one. I think the real weakness of CVE is that it demands community participation. And so the sort of political education of communities, but also of mental health professionals, people who might be conscripted into doing this work, I think is really important. So I just think like if all of us go back to our own communities and our own circles and, talk about CVE and talk about the ways it might show up, I think is important. I also think, I know this is being recorded, but UIC is a hotbed for the production of pro-CVE research. This is not a secret. Students have been agitating and protesting against this for a few years. And so I think, trying to undo that relationship where there's faculty on campus who get to say all this kind of anti-Muslim stuff and get grants, get money, get awards. I think really troubling that is important. And I think part of this, this might be too academic-y, but is to somehow get the IRB. This is one of the student demands, to get the IRB to have a representative from the community reviewing IRB applications, because it is social science research that has justified the expansion of CVE, and it all comes from UIC. So, preventing that research from being done, I think is really important. And I know folks on West Campus are integrating into their curriculum like an anti-CVE framework, connecting it to the other ways medicine and public health have been mobilized against communities of color historically. So I think there is some of that work that's going on from within, but also to really pressure the administration, to pressure West Campus, to pressure the IRB review committees, to really reconsider what counts as ethical research. Is research proving Muslims are terrorists? Is that ethical research? So I think there's the academic UIC side, and then there's also the work we have to do in our own communities, our own professional communities, to really amplify resistance that has been going on for the last couple of years. So those are the two main things I would say.
Super helpful. Thanks, Nicole. Well, Ryan, you could either respond or there's another question from Olivia. Maybe I'll just read it since we have 5 minutes. Then when you respond, you can integrate both. Do you consider European countries not accepting Islamic culture, such as the issue over pictures of the Prophet in France? That must be another issue with CVE.
Yeah, France is just another hotbed of like CVE, anti-Muslim garbage, and it used the Charlie Hebdo attacks as a as a justification for making changes within its curriculum to essentially say we need to, we need to amplify our Frenchness. We can't have any of, these other things. You can't wear a headscarf. You can't do all of these things that jeopardize our sense of Frenchness. So yeah, France is overtly anti-Muslim, and then they've created not only policies but practices within schools to agitate against Islam and Muslim communities on the premise that these are threats to French security, and also to a sense of Frenchness that's like rooted in their perceived secularism. So that's in France, it's in Belgium, it's in the UK. Like it's that sentiment is all throughout the EU, and so they all have these both surveillance practices, but also just like really coercive policing practices, really coercive social policies that directly target Muslim communities.
Ryan, the floor is yours. If you want to comment on either of those.
I just want to amplify a couple of aspects that I saw in Nicole's work that were really, wonderful, and they do point the way for more action. One was the way in which her work talks about the uh-oh feeling, right, which is used as a way to, by these average citizens in their CVE surveillance work, to identify people that are potentially suspect. And Nicole points out quite clearly how this uh-oh feeling is shaped by histories, it's shaped by socialization. And I think that that points out how important it is for us to continue to interrogate the baseline generalizations and assumptions and stereotypes that circulate in society, and that we ourselves sometimes are even part of. And yet, even further, I think Nicole's work points out how in the CVE work, that on the one hand, it was a rejection of culturalist thinking about whole groups of people and a move towards trying to look at the individualized journeys of different people in this quote unquote radicalization theory. But I think Nicole points out clearly that even that radicalization theory itself needs to be interrogated in many respects. And really fundamentally, the bigger question that we need to be asking is something else that Nicole raises in her book, which is why this community? Why is it that the Muslim, Arab, or South Asian communities, why are they targeted as opposed to other communities? And even then, we need to kind of look at the sort of political underpinnings for why people would find themselves to be alienated or to have grievances that they feel need to be acted upon. Hopefully I got that correct, Nicole. Let me know if if I'm off in that, or if you want to add anything to that.
That was so generous, Ryan, of you to uplift those aspects of her work. There are a couple points about the Philippines and a plug for Freddie Gonzalez's class, GLAS 465, Asian Diasporas in Latin America, which will be offered again next year. Okay. The IRB is that's Anna, you're commenting on that as a separate thing, right?
No, just for clarification for folks who are wondering what
Got
IRB
it.
stands for.
Okay, I get that. That's good.
I'm
That's
sorry.
Good. No, that's fine. I
Not
was
a
like, that'll be
fan of the
interesting. I
IRB.
want to take Freddie's class and learn more about surveillance IRB, but the class is still really looks so important. And also it looks like it does a lot of the, cross work that we were doing here. So there are a couple questions. We have 1 minute left. So I'll just say one thing really briefly. And then if either of you can see the chat and want to say anything about the Philippines, which of course is like an essential connection here to this discussion with the anti-terror law and so much else of surveillance, et cetera, and counter surveillance. But yeah, just in closing, I mean, it seems like what we're being asked by these incredible speakers that have just committed so much of their lives to researching this for all of us is to not take for granted categories that you see in society. Like if you hear these are the good Muslims and these are the bad Muslims, instead of saying, well, are they bad or good? Because that's taking the categories for granted. But instead asking critically, like, what are the political conditions that produce these categories in the first place? So it kind of seems like that's the methodology that you're both putting out there for us, as well as many more, like we talked about, solidarity and transnationalism, et cetera, just for students to think about how this relates to what you're already learning in your classes. So do either of the speakers just maybe take like 30 seconds and say like a closing thought?
This is not well developed, but I see the Philippines comments, and people are talking about France and these Latin America. So I think it's important just to highlight how what CVE is doing isn't new, and it's not disconnected from other places and other tactics. And so I think the more we can draw from, understand, learn from other struggles against these types of practices and make connections, even if they're, while recognizing they're connected and also distinct, I think that's really important as an organizing tactic, as well as like an intellectual project to help us understand what's going on with particular policing projects or colonial projects. I think that's really important. So all the connections people are making, this sounds like this sounds like this, is this connected to this? I think those are really important questions, because they're drawing these, some folks have referred to these as counter topographical lines, connecting places that don't seem similar, but are connected by the ways, for example, US empire enacts war in different places. That's one way of making these counter topographical lines to connect places. So I think all of this is just really important to say that this is not unique and it's not disconnected from other places.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Ryan?
Just want to say again, it's so important, this research and this work. I still fear that CVE is a little bit underappreciated, or it's not very well known, I think, in the general population. So I do want to encourage the students here to try to spread information about the CVE. There are documentaries that have been developed around this and programs to try to bring attention to CVE. And I think that more work along those lines needs to be done, especially because so many innocent people are being sort of targeted in this dragnet, which is being applied haphazardly around the country.
Nadine, you're muted.
Right, had to have one Zoom faux pas. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to everyone, Glenda and Erica, who did a lot of the background work, to GLAS and Anna for making this possible. And of course to Ryan and Nicole and everybody who came. So stay tuned for more from GLAS's events and work and classes next semester.